With all of the focus on climate change, urban pollution has taken a back seat. But as the world becomes more populated, there's more cars on the roads, more industry making products, and as such, more pollution. In some areas, so bad, it's having major health impacts. You only have to think back to the Olympics in China to remember that the world waited with bated breath to see if the smog would lift so that the athletes could compete. And indeed, China shut down huge sections of industry to ensure that the pollution shifted. I spoke with a leading researcher in urban pollution from London to find out what the latest evidence is showing.
But really, the air pollution has changed as much as anything else. It's now more transport related, but the improvements in the transport fleet have reduced emissions, and consequently some of the air pollution concentrations have reduced. So really we're dealing with now is the ones that are very tough to deal with, and that's why there is a focus on particles, because of its health associations and because it's difficult to actually reduce. Whilst people talk about particles as a single item or a single group of items, it's a real mixture of everything. So whilst road traffic, like diesel vehicles, is an important source, there's a whole host of sources. Some are generated in the atmosphere through secondary chemical reactions, some are emitted directly from like vehicle exhausts or other industrial processes. And what the actual component of PM, which causes some of these problems in terms of cardiovascular and respiratory health, is still quite uncertain. So it's kind of growing area in terms of research. The one that most people focus on is particulates, small pieces of dust, and they're influential in people with existing respiratory illness, but perhaps more so with existing cardiovascular illness. When you start looking at the impacts of traffic management and then looking at the health signal, you end up in a very complex situation. So it's difficult to actually identify, yes, that was the benefit of the congestion charge, or that was the benefit of the low emission zone. You can calculate them using standard sort of health impact assessment methods, but to take it to the next phase, to epidemiology, is a much harder step, I think.
So how do you know how much pollution there is? Do you measure the air, or do you take the number of cars on the road and multiply them to get a figure? How does it work?
We have the amount of traffic road by road, essentially, and then we have what's called a stop model, which tells us the age of the vehicle fleet. And then depending on the age of the vehicle fleet, you know what associated emissions standard they have to meet. And through various tests on vehicles, we can work out, it's just a simple multiplication to find out what the emissions are from different cars. It is quite important that we tread quite carefully, because there are sort of trade-offs between air quality on the one hand and climate change on the other, or reducing energy consumption generally. One of the obvious ones is the diesel fleet. So rather than a lot of people in the UK, as an interim sort of between switching to an electric fleet, have been promoting diesel vehicles because they're more fuel efficient. But the problem with that is that it increases PM and NOx emissions, because they also emit more of those two compared with, say, a petrol equivalent. So there's an awful lot of trade-offs, and again, there's no perfect solution. But I think ultimately most countries are aiming towards sort of replacing their fleet long-term with electric vehicles.
Is it true that the pollution from really polluted cities is travelling across the sea and polluting relatively clean cities?
In London's case, and I'm sure from other cities around the world, there's quite a large contribution from outside of the city, so it's not all generated locally.
How far can these particles drift?
Hundreds, thousands of kilometres. They're very small.
So are you able to analyse pollution plumes to work out where they come from? Can you work out if one's come from Italy or from France?
You can use dispersion models to actually backtrack and find out where the sources of some of these emissions are. But at the moment we don't fixate on, sort of identifying individual nations' contributions. The problem with that is that anything you do locally only has a limited effect, because you have this contribution from outside. But equally, if you're looking to the future and trying to find out what particles actually cause health problems, then it may be that actually very localised influences or very localised changes to traffic are quite important at reducing the certain components of PM10 and therefore benefit people's health.
And there's a particular problem with NO and NO2, that's nitric and nitrous oxide?
The emission directly from vehicles is just known as NOx, which is a combination of NO and NO2. And recently we've looked at emission forecasts, and we've looked at the actual change in NOx from measurements. What the emissions images seem to be telling us is that as vehicles get newer, they emit less in terms of NOx and also in terms of PM10. So there's a benefit in moving them forward and making the vehicle fleet newer, and that's really where the focus lies.
So does changing the bus fleet, changing from petrol to gas and changing traffic flow patterns so that cars aren't stopped at lights for long periods of time have a real effect?
I mean, everyone's looking for that sort of the perfect solution. I don't really think it exists as such. I think it is a case of a very small step. So, as you mentioned, not having people stood around in their cars at traffic lights and so on is one of them. Changing the vehicle fleet. I think in the longer term what will happen is there'll be a switch from potentially very sort of localised management to a far sort of wider regional scale type management of air quality, and things like black carbon spring to mind, and also things like ozone and its and the health impacts. And I think slowly that'll be the change between a sort of dealing with traffic very locally and then dealing with emission sources generally on a regional scale.